Welcome, guys, to the 22nd episode of Twin Legends. With me today, we have our guest, Martin Refalo. Martin, welcome to our podcast. I'll ask you to tell us a bit about yourself.
For sure. Thanks so much, Andre. I'm really looking forward to chatting today. So, I am a coach in the fitness industry. I've been a coach for nearly 10 years now. I work with clients face to face and online. And the whole time I've spent coaching, I've also been studying in the background. So I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in exercise science, and I have recently completed a PhD in the same area, looking at muscle hypertrophy specifically. Still waiting on the results of my thesis, so I can't say I've graduated yet, but I'm very close. And over the past 3 years, my focus has been looking at the influence of proximity to failure on muscle hypertrophy. So that is the key topic of my thesis. And I have been lucky enough to work with a great team of scientists who've helped supervise me over the journey. And we've been able to publish a bunch of papers together in this area and just broadly in muscle hypertrophy as well. So that's where I'm at the moment, and I look forward to helping raise the standard of the fitness industry over the coming years. That's a big part of my role as a coach, as an educator, and as a mentor for many coaches out there in the industry.
Awesome to hear. Can you tell us, Martin, why did you choose that study? What were your questions that you want to be answered?
Yeah, so the reason I chose this topic for my PhD is because I'm interested in ideas that have stood the test of time. And in the fitness industry, there is this idea that training has to be hard to build muscle, and it's been around for a long time. And that's a good sign, because if it's been around for a long time, it probably means that we should put some stock into the idea. And I like to use the tools of science to better understand certain ideas and answer specific questions. So I want to know more about the term hard in resistance training. We use the term hard quite loosely, I think, or at least from my observations, it seems like the term hard is used quite loosely. A lot of people associate that term with proximity to failure. And of course, that's what I'm specifically studying. But when you zoom out, you have to understand that there are a lot more components to the term hard. Okay, so it's completely possible for someone to not be pushing really, really close to failure, but still be training hard and still be stimulating muscle hypertrophy. So these are the sorts of ideas that go through my head, and I want to better understand them using the tools of science. That's why I've embarked on this PhD, and why I have designed several studies now that specifically look at how proximity to failure may influence muscle hypertrophy and other responses that we may be interested in as coaches that may impact longer term outcomes with our clients. So fatigue being one of them, perceptual responses like perceived discomfort and exertion being another. And I believe this most recent study that was published is the fifth in my series of studies that explore this topic. And it all started with a scoping review back in 2022, where I critiqued the literature. I identified some important research gaps that I then decided to try and fill in the subsequent studies with a meta-analysis and 3 experimental studies. So a meta-analysis is a little different to some of the experimental studies that I have actually needed to conduct by collecting data on the gym floor or in the lab.
Martin, can you tell us a bit about what your future studies, if you have one that in mind?
I don't have any specific future studies in mind right now. I want to take a little break from collecting data, but what we talk about today, I have some follow-up research that will be coming out in the coming months. So the most recent study, if you read through the paper, you'll notice that I recruited both males and females. So I'll be doing a sex differences analysis to work out if the results were influenced by sex. And of course, I also assessed perceptual responses in the study that we're going to be speaking about, and they're not written there in the study because I didn't include them in the analysis, and that's going to form another paper. So everything we speak about today will definitely be followed up in the coming months with some more research.
Yeah, I saw a story of yourself that I think you posted like 2-3 days ago about that, the female and the male, and I was
very interesting.
like, yeah, I clicked on waiting for more.
Yes. Soon.
Martin, if you can please tell us a bit about the study. What were all the participants trained? More about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, for sure. So I've alluded to this study that we're going to be talking about, and I'll try my best to explain the design in a concise manner. So the goal of this study was to investigate how an RIR-based approach to set termination would compare to just training to failure on every set. Now, importantly, this is the first time this type of study has been conducted. So in previous research, we often have a group of participants training to failure, and we compare them with a group of participants training not to failure. Now, not to failure can mean many different things. I mean, Andre, if I tell you not to train to failure, you're going to go into the gym and you're not going to know where to start. But if I gave you a more specific prescription, like a RIR prescription.
Yeah, I think you saw. Sorry, I thought you said start and not stop.
Start.
Where to stop? Right?
Where to stop? You wouldn't know where to start in the gym, but you also wouldn't know where to stop. That's right. That's very right. You wouldn't know where to stop in your set. And if I gave you an RIR prescription, though, you'd have a much better idea of where you should be stopping your set. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to give my participants a better idea of their set termination point using RIR. And as a function of that, the readers of this paper are also going to know that it wasn't just a group of participants training not to failure, but they were actually training around 1 to 2 RIR. So that's what I did. I had a group of participants and I got them to train one leg to failure across 8 weeks on the leg press and the leg extension, whereas the other leg, so their opposing leg, trained to the RIR targets I prescribed. So 2 RIR on the leg press and 1 RIR on the leg extension. So that was the comparison. Okay, so importantly, it's important to know that I wasn't comparing between individuals. I was comparing within individuals, left leg to right leg. And that accounts for factors like genetics that may differ between individuals, sleep, stress, nutritional differences between individuals too. Of course, all these factors may influence the outcomes, but my design, whereby I compared one leg to the other, took care of that. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, to investigate outcomes, what I did was I used an ultrasound assessment to measure muscle thickness. So I measured muscle thickness of the vastus lateralis and the rectus femoris. I did that before training and after training to evaluate how much muscle hypertrophy the participants experienced. And I also assessed outcomes like neuromuscular fatigue and perceptual responses, as I mentioned before. And I measured these responses, both fatigue and perceived discomfort, exertion, etc., over time. Because a lot of the previous research does that, but it does it acutely after one bout of training. But we have reason to think things may change over time as you expose yourself to the same stimulus. So that was the broad design of the study. It's also important to know that the participants were very well trained. So on average, they had about 7 to 8 years of training experience, which is the highest reported training experience in this area of research, where studies compare failure versus non-failure. They had as a sample, 50% of the sample had experience competing in bodybuilding or powerlifting, which is pretty cool to know. I assessed their RIR accuracy before the study started. right? And I found that they were within 1 repetition of the RIR targets I prescribed, which means throughout the intervention, we can think of them being pretty close to the RIR targets that they had to reach. Of course, I don't know how close they were because I didn't test them throughout the intervention, but that initial assessment does give us some confidence that they were at least close to the targets I prescribed. And remember, in practice, when you use RIR, you're never actually going to know how close you truly are. So you really have to back yourself in and test yourself over time. And the final thing I'll touch on is the volume, because people often ask about the volume and how many sets the participants were doing. Now, in my study, what I did was I personalized the volume to each participant based on the amount of volume they were completing for their quads prior to the study commencing. So, for example, Andre, if you were to sign up for my study and be a participant and you had been doing 12 sets for your quads in your own training program, I'd look at that program, I'd count up 12 sets, and I would then use that as your prescription in the study. Those 12 sets would then be spread across 2 sessions in a week, because participants were doing 2 sessions a week, and evenly distributed across the leg press and the leg extension.
Thank you, Martin, for explaining. One of the topics that I wanted to mention is that many people say that on the studies there's bad concept of the study, because the participants normally do less be less on the RER than they should be. But since you tested the participants before, you think that that's completely secure for saying?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. Basically, what you're saying is that it's quite common for people to underestimate their RIR. So they might think they're at a 2 RIR, but they might actually be at a 4 or a 5. Now, I would say that may be the case, but only in certain demographics. So I'm not sure it would be the case in a resistance-trained demographic that has experience pushing to failure and pushing close to their limits, and even beyond their limits, as they should be if they're quite well trained. An untrained population, though, or an untrained demographic of individuals who have only just started training, yes, they're likely going to be a little inaccurate. Now, we do have some larger bodies of evidence via meta-analysis that show participants in studies can, on average, be pretty close to the target set, within that 1 repetition range. And I think in practice, as practitioners, coaches, it's important to just look at the client in front of you and work out whether or not they need more practice with RIR or whether they are where they need to be. So I won't prescribe RIR with people who I just don't think are going to be accurate with it. I will wait until they are trained enough and wait until they've been exposed to failure frequently enough to prescribe an RIR target for their training. So that's important to know. And bringing it back to the study design, we can't eliminate RIR accuracy or potential RIR inaccuracy as a limitation to the study. Of course, there's going to be some variability around the RIR targets that I prescribe. Participants aren't going to be perfect for the whole 8 weeks. We have confidence they might be close to the target, but we know they're probably not going to be perfect. And although we can't eliminate that as a limitation, I don't think we should really view it as a limitation, because in practice, when we use an RIR-based approach, we also don't know how close to the targets we really are. Like I said before, we have to back ourselves in. So although I did prescribe an RIR target in my study, I was more concerned about knowing how an RIR-based approach to set termination as a whole compares to pushing to failure. So what I mean by that, Andre, is that in some instances, participants actually accidentally reached failure on the RIR leg. They accidentally pushed too hard. And that happens in practice too. Sometimes you push too hard, and sometimes you might not push hard enough, right? It might vary, and over time, we do want it to be closer to the target, but there's always going to be some level of variability. We just need to close that gap or that range, if you will, over time.
Yeah, I think it makes completely sense. If I can, I'll give my opinion and I'll ask you if
Yep.
you agree with that. But it's easier, like, to go to failure than to try to maintain 2 or 3 RER. So even after, if you go to failure, you can, okay, if 10 is my max, then next time I can do 8 or 7, right?
Yeah, true.
And you can. I think it's easier than trying to not go to failure. Martin, the next question is: do you think it will come with the same results if it were made with other muscle groups instead of the quads?
Okay, good question. So in this study, we only assessed the rectus femoris and the vastus lateralis, so muscles of the quadriceps. So the results are specific to that. I don't really see any reason to think that it wouldn't apply to other muscle groups. But I think what we always have to keep our focus on in practice is how proximity to failure interacts with other variables. Because I think in practice, it's never going to come down to one specific variable. There's multiple variables that will influence the training stimulus and the subsequent muscle hypertrophy. So, for example, in other muscle groups, maybe pushing to failure wouldn't yield the same repetition loss across multiple sets, right? Now, will that impact the results? Possibly, because you're not losing as much volume across multiple sets. Okay, in some muscle groups are going to cause more fatigue than others, right? By virtue of their size, potentially, or the exercises that stimulate them, right? Whether they be compound or single joint movements.
Yeah.
So there is a lot going on. And although I think the basic principle may hold that, pushing very close to failure provides similar results to pushing to failure, I think that holds across most muscle groups, or all muscle groups. In practice, it always comes down to how proximity to failure interacts with the other variables, right? How many exercises are you doing in a session, right? How much rest are you getting in between your exercises and between your sets, right? How fatigable are the muscles that you're training? All these questions also have to be considered when you're programming. So it's very hard to give a concrete answer to that question because I'm a researcher and I have a good understanding of research methods and I can make inferences from the conclusions that my research generates, but I'm also a coach and I have experience on the gym floor working with clients and writing programs. And when you write a program and a client executes it, it's always going to come down to how the combination of training variables is influencing the stimulus and the subsequent response to that stimulus.
It completely makes sense. Martin, if you can talk about it, why did you choose the leg press and after the leg extension? Can you explain this, please?
Yeah, I have a very simple and pragmatic answer to that question. I've been asked that question a lot. And the simple answer is, well, let me ask you a question, Andre. Do you do the leg press and the leg extension?
Nope.
You don't?
I do squats and leg extension.
Well, you do the leg extension. You do one of them.
Yeah.
Have you ever done the leg press?
Of course.
Of course you have. How many do you program the leg press for your clients?
Yes.
Okay.
Normally.
Do you program the leg extension for your clients?
Yeah.
Do most of the gyms in Portugal have a leg press and a leg extension?
Yes.
You're answering the question for me. So it's because most people have done the exercise. It's because the exercises are quite stable and most people are going to be able to push close to failure with them. It's because my gym had them available. And it's because I also think they're simply good exercises to target the quads. We have a leg press, which works the quads hard and lengthened to kind of mid position throughout the rep. We have the leg extension, which is working the shortened position of the rep. So we're trying to capture the full range of motion there. That's why I chose those exercises. It doesn't get any more complicated than that. There are also exercises where I can track the lifting velocity of the reps on, especially the leg press. It's very easy to hook up the device that I need to track the lifting velocity and then measure the fatigue across multiple sets. So that's my answer to that question. And if you're going to ask about the rep range, as well, it's a similar answer. Okay, the reason I chose 8 to 10 reps on the leg press, or at least an 8 to 10 rep max on the leg press and a 10 to 12 rep max on the leg extension, is because they're pretty commonly used rep ranges. They don't cause a whole heap of discomfort, and they're not taking up too much time, right? It's not going to take up a whole minute to just complete a set because you're doing so many reps. So again, very practical answers to those types of questions.
Thank you, Martin. One of the parts that I wanted to go is why did you not, I think you already talked about it, but why did you not equal the volume on every participant? For example, like why not make like 20 sets for everyone and try to maintain it?
That's a really good point. So I alluded to this earlier. I alluded to how, Andre, if you were to sign up for the study, you would be allocated the same number of sets for your quads as you had previously been doing. And the reason I did that for each participant is because if I had prescribed a universal number of sets, right, for the whole sample to follow, let's say everyone has to do 10 sets. Imagine you came into the study having been doing 20 sets for your quads, right? You would then have to halve your set volume, right? You'd have to halve it. That's a big decrease. Now, is that going to lead to less muscle hypertrophy? I'm not sure. Possibly. Is it going to lead to more? Again, I don't know. But what I can say is there's probably going to be a slightly variable response to the one you've already been having. Now, on the flip side, if we have someone who's only been doing 5 sets for their quads, right, and they come into the study and now they have to do 10 because everyone's doing 10, they're doubling their set volume. Is that going to lead to a different response to the one they've been having? Possibly. And more importantly, is it going to lead to a different response to the one you're now having, right? Because you've halved your set volume. This other person has doubled theirs. What implications does that have for the overall sample, right, and the results that we gather? In the case of my study, I think personalizing the volume is an important aspect of the design because it doesn't interfere with with what the client has already been doing or what the participant has already been doing. And you might ask, well, that means that participants in the study were doing a different number of sets, right? You might be doing 12, Andre, someone else might be doing 14, I might be doing 10. What implications does that have? Well, not many at all. It doesn't have any implications because each participant was doing the same number of sets on their left and their right leg. So again, that within subject design that I was describing earlier takes care of differences in sets between individuals. It takes care of that because we're comparing left to right leg, and it was always the case that the legs were completing the same amount of volume, the legs being compared right within the same individual.
Yeah, for me it makes completely sense that you made it that way. Can we talk about the neuromuscular fatigue? Can you give us a simple explanation on what it is?
For sure. So neuromuscular fatigue is simply, for me as a coach, the way I would describe what neuromuscular fatigue is. Well, it's a decrease in your muscle's ability to produce force. Okay. Why does that happen? Well, it happens due to a few reasons. Right? For example, we may experience a decrease in neural drive coming from the central nervous system. We also might experience an increase in metabolite accumulation within the muscle and a decrease in glycogen, for example, in the muscle that results in the muscle's decrease in force-producing capabilities, right? So it can happen either in the muscle or it can stem from the central nervous system. Either of those two pathways can cause fatigue. Now, in practice, right, or in research on the gym floor, it's hard to measure neuromuscular fatigue directly. So it's hard for me to measure exactly what's happening in my muscles or what's happening on the level of the central nervous system. We need quite sophisticated equipment to do that. So instead of directly investigating neuromuscular fatigue, I used proxy measures of neuromuscular fatigue. What that means is I was using more practical, easy to administer measures that can indicate neuromuscular fatigue is present. Now, Andre, as a coach, I'm sure you'll sometimes notice on the gym floor when you're working with some clients, you might notice that on the first set, they do 10 reps, and maybe if you don't rest long enough, with the same weight, they'll only do 6 on the second set, right? Or maybe by the third set, they've done 6. That to me is an indication that neuromuscular fatigue is present, because with a given load, an individual is now not able to complete the maximum number of reps that they could possibly do, right? Or that they were otherwise doing when they were fresh. So that there is an explanation of repetition loss from the first to the final set. And that was one of the proxy measures I used in my study to indicate how much neuromuscular fatigue the participants may have been under. Another measure was changes in lifting velocity from the first to the final set, which I briefly described earlier. If your rep speed is slowing down drastically from the first to the final set, right? If your final set is really, really slow compared to the first one, and you're trying to push every rep as fast as you can, that's also an indication of neuromuscular fatigue. And that has been validated in research. So we know it correlates well with actual fatigue. So we can use it as a more practical and easy to administer measure in research. And those were the two measures that I used and that are reported in the paper.
I think it's funny because one of the most common measures that, like, we as online coaches normally see on the videos of our clients is the velocity, right? And
Correct.
Most of the videos, and I think it's nice that you also did it on your study. One of the parts that most intrigued me was the fatigue management of the study, and for me it makes complete sense. When we talk about failure, going to failure gives more fatigue than having more reps in reserve, make us question about exercise selection, for example, when you should go to failure and when to not to. What were your conclusion as a coach? As for your clients, did anything change for you?
Okay, so I think I can quickly describe the results of the study, and then I'll give you my coach's perspective. So what I found was that across the 8 weeks, the hypertrophy or the change in muscle thickness that the participants experienced was similar between the RIR protocol and the failure protocol. It was quite similar. Now, there were some muscle-specific differences that require further investigation and that are talked about briefly in the paper, but the main finding was similar hypertrophy across the protocols. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, like I said before, there's other things to consider, and this is why I also assessed neuromuscular fatigue over time. And what I found using those two measures I described earlier was that at all points throughout the study, failure was experiencing more fatigue than RIR. So the failure protocol generated more fatigue than the RIR protocol, but it depended on the exercise being performed and the stage of the intervention. So, for example, on the leg press, there was more of a difference at the beginning of the intervention in fatigue between the protocols, less of a difference towards the end. In the leg extension or on the leg extension, the difference is pretty similar throughout, but interestingly, the repetition loss decreased as the intervention went on. So participants lost less repetitions from the first to the final set as the weeks went by, which is some evidence for improved fatigue resistance. We didn't see that as much on the leg press, but we saw it on the leg extension. So something to keep in mind there, but at all times, training to failure generated more fatigue than keeping some reps in reserve. So, yeah, do you have a follow-up question?
If you don't mind, why did you think that happened? The fatigue were less on the leg extension?
Okay, so the reason I think we saw fatigue resistance on the leg extension is because it's a more isolated exercise. Now, Andre, you're doing the leg extension in your program right now. When you are working towards the end of your set, I'm sure you feel a burn in your quads. Okay, and I'm sure you don't feel like you do when you have a bar on your back and you're squatting, where you feel your head's about to burst and you're breathing really heavily and you're feeling a little bit drained. You might also get a similar feeling on the leg press if you put it back in your program. It seems to affect your whole body a little bit more, whereas the leg extension seems to just affect the quad. So yes, there is some demand across the whole body, but most of it's going to be in the quads, which means one's ability to recover in between sets likely comes down to the quad's ability to resynthesize ATP in between sets and to remove metabolite buildup and to manage the calcium flux of the muscle cells. So there's less mechanisms that likely influence fatigue with a leg extension. So when we're doing these tests, it might be easier to capture the possible fatigue resistance that one might experience. Whereas on the leg press, because there's more things at play, there's a cardiovascular demand, there's a bit more discomfort, you have to maintain stability across sets and across weeks, and that might change a little bit. There's a little more going on, and that might vary a little bit. Right, so it might be harder to capture fatigue resistance there. It's also important to note that with the failure protocol, it was always failure, so that's fine. But with the RIR protocol, like I said before, although we're confident the participants were pretty close to the RIR targets, there was likely still some variability from week to week, and it's completely possible that participants were, on average, pushing closer to failure on their RIR leg towards the end of the intervention, which showed up as them experiencing more fatigue, right? Maybe they were pacing themselves subconsciously. Who knows? In the first week of the intervention, they're a bit more conservative. Maybe they were closer to a 3 RIR, right, than a 2. And then towards the end, they were close to a 1 maybe than they were a 2. Still close to the 2, but like I said, there's likely going to be some variability because it's normal. I think that was an important point that provides a bit more context to some of these findings. So now we know how, muscle hypertrophy might play out across an 8-week period, like across a training program maybe for your clients. We know how fatigue is likely going to play out as well. This is likely going to be the case if you're working with a resistance-trained individual who meets the rough criteria of the study design, right? Who meets the rough criteria of the sample that I was studying. If we're assuming the population is normally distributed, these are the results that we're likely going to expect. Now, as a coach, though, as we look at those findings and we read through them, what we have to remember is that the results of studies, whether they are experimental studies like the one we are speaking about today, or whether they are meta-analyses, right, studies of studies, regardless, they can never really refute or verify a theory, at least not in exercise science. They can only strengthen, right, or weaken a theory. So if we have a theory that states as sets are terminated closer to failure, on average, we're likely going to see more muscle hypertrophy, right? That's been the long-standing idea in the fitness industry. If that's the theory, the results of this study just weaken that theory slightly, at least towards the top end of the relationship between proximity to failure and muscle hypertrophy. So, that's not to say that there's no difference between training with 5 reps in reserve and training to failure, right? But if you're training pretty damn close to failure, around that 1 to 2 RIR mark, and we compare that with failure, maybe we're not going to be seeing many differences at that point. At least that's the evidence that this study provides. So it's just weakening the theory slightly at the top end of the relationship. And what we have to remember is that all knowledge in science is provisional. So just like every other study that has been published in this area, they're not concrete. The findings aren't concrete. Every finding comes with its own limitation, and in some cases comes with many limitations, and we have to consider those limitations when we are speaking about findings and when we are attempting to apply them in practice. Okay, so the stock that we put into a certain finding needs to be considered relative to the limitations, right, that are baked into the finding too. Again, whether that be a meta-analysis or an experimental study. So for me and my programming, I never really use one finding or one conclusion to make decisions. Okay, as a coach, even as a researcher and coach, I don't do that, because I know that in practice, there's always going to be so many more variables that need to be considered. In research, we often isolate variables. We try and isolate variables to tease out certain effects. Okay, and for example, in my study, I supervised every single participant, every single session. Right? Not everyone in the real world is going to get that type of treatment where they have someone yelling in their ear with every rep that they do. Okay, I wish I had someone who just followed me around and told me to do more reps, but I don't, unfortunately. I try and train with people here and there. That always helps. But I don't get that treatment. That's just an example of how what happens in research can't always happen in practice. Okay, and we have to be able to understand that, because if we try and apply research outside its strictly bounded domain, we're going to be led astray. And that might affect our programming and negatively affect the results that we get with our clients. So with all that said, I think in practice, we need to look at proximity to failure and try to build up an understanding of how proximity to failure may influence muscle hypertrophy. And for me at the moment, it's pretty simple, right? Pushing closer to failure on average is likely going to lead to more muscle hypertrophy, but there may not be much of a difference between keeping 1 or 2 reps in the tank and pushing to failure, right? But of course, that needs to be considered with volume, the load lifted, exercise selection, and even exercise order. And there's probably others that I'm missing. Frequency is another one, right? So if I have a client who in one of their sessions, they're doing an upper body session and they're doing side raises for their shoulders, and that's all they're doing for their shoulders in that session, I'm not going to tell them to be keeping 3 reps in reserve or 2 reps in reserve. Why? And why would I do that if they don't have another shoulder exercise coming up? Okay, all I have to be concerned about there is how fatigue from one set might influence the other. If someone is quite fatigue resistant, right, then I might tell them to push to failure on every set. Or if they have all the time in the world and they can rest 5 minutes in between sets, I might say push to failure if you can rest 5 minutes. Whereas if a client doesn't have that much time, they fatigue a little bit faster than the average, I might tell them to keep a rep or 2 in the tank on the first 2 sets and then maybe push to failure on the last set. So hopefully you're starting to build an understanding of how I always use multiple variables to make decisions. Okay, exercise order is another one. So to bring it back to the findings of my study, I alluded to the fact that we found some muscle-specific differences. What I found in my study was that the vastus lateralis, which is stimulated more on the leg press than the leg extension, grew more in the failure protocol. Okay, but the rectus femoris, which is stimulated more in the leg extension than the leg press, grew more in the RIR protocol. Now, you might ask, well, why is that the case? And do keep in mind, the differences I'm speaking about here are very minor. So they're very minor, but the trends were there. I think it's something worth speaking about and something that warrants future investigation. So what I'm speaking about here is quite speculative, but it's possible that because the leg press was always performed before the leg extension, it's possible that training to failure on the leg press maximized hypertrophy of the vastus lateralis, but compromised hypertrophy of the rectus femoris on the leg extension because it entered the leg extension more fatigued, whereas the RIR leg entered the leg extension being less fatigued and accumulated more volume there. which may have caused more hypertrophy in the rectus femoris, right? But because we kept reps in the tank on the leg press when the muscle was fresh, it was compromised slightly. That's my hypothesis. That's not a concrete statement or a concrete claim that I'm putting forward, but I'm saying this might be something we consider in practice. And I think as a coach, you should always consider how what you do now might affect what you do later. That's a simple heuristic that I use, right? If I give someone a squat now and I tell them to go really, really hard on the squat, and then I tell them to do deadlifts after that, then I tell them to do leg presses after that, and then walking lunges, right? I wouldn't really like seeing that on a program if I was a coach, right? If I am a coach, if I was seeing someone else's program, I wouldn't really like to see that. I'd probably say, hey, we probably need to change that a little bit, because what you're doing now is having a big impact on what you're doing next, and so on. And I think we can take that broad heuristic and apply it to proximity to failure. Maybe, right, it's a good idea to leave something in the tank on the first exercise you do if it's a big compound movement, and push harder towards the end of the session when fatigue is less of an issue. Okay? But again, that needs to be considered within the total amount of volume you're doing, right? When you're doing your next session, the type of exercises you choose, and so on. But that's how I think of these ideas as a coach.
Yeah. Martin, one of the questions that I wanted to ask, if, for example, if we compare training to failure versus intensive techniques like myo reps or supersets that people use, normally we use them for training to failure or after it. Do you still find those techniques useful? I mean, even it's the evidence saying that, okay, it's almost the same result. If you use the techniques that you have less rest time, you try to push it to the limit. And most of the cases, people use it like every week. Can you give us your opinion on that?
Yeah. So remember, this study only looked at the initial point of failure versus RIR. So in practice, some people will say, well, what if you push beyond failure? Now, to me, beyond failure is just extending the set. So there's only one failure point in a set, right? It's momentary muscular failure based on the exercise, the resistance profile of that exercise. And when you can't do any more reps within the allocated range of motion, you've hit that failure point. Now, has the muscle itself reached complete failure? I don't know. In some cases, probably not. So you might extend the set and push beyond failure to ensure that the whole muscle has experienced failure throughout the whole range of motion. That's an idea that some people put forth, and that's fair enough. That's not something I investigated in this study. But what this study found was that pushing harder, right, within a set, doing more within a set, isn't always better for muscle hypertrophy. So it can be better in some cases. It isn't always better, though, based on the setup of the program, the protocols that I had in place. Now, in practice, again, we have to think about that claim. Okay, pushing closer to failure isn't always better for muscle hypertrophy. We have to think about that, but then again, apply it within the context of our client. I think there's a room for intensity techniques, no doubt about that. You know, some intensity techniques have certain properties that might make them conducive to building muscle in certain circumstances. Do you have to apply intensity techniques onto every set that you do? I don't think so. Is it worthwhile applying intensity techniques on the last set of some exercises? Possibly. I could see that being the case across multiple exercises and across, weeks of a training program. I think at the end of the day, it's all about striking the balance between imposing a stimulus that exceeds the threshold required for adaptation, right, and that is in line with the client's desired rate of progress and their goals. It's about striking the balance between that and the level of fatigue and damage that you're also incurring, right? So when we think about the term hard, right, well, how do you define the term hard? it's a little hard to define. I just gave you my definition, right? Repeatedly imposing a stimulus that exceeds the threshold required for adaptation, and that is in line with the desired progress of the client. So if you have a client who is building muscle and strength and whatever it is, and they're doing it pretty well because you're measuring it, you're making sure they're eating in a calorie surplus, you're checking their body weight, you're taking photos of them, you're measuring their arms, right, and their chest and all that stuff, you're getting the DEXA scans, you're measuring it, they're building muscle. Well, maybe you don't need to change anything. Maybe you don't need to add intensity techniques if you're just doing a standard program with straight sets. I think straight sets work extremely well for a long time. If someone is now plateauing and you're not noticing the gains that you once were, and so the hard training you're doing isn't in line, or the training you're doing is now not in line with their desired rate of progress, okay, think about how you might add intensity techniques into the overall picture. Or maybe it's just a matter of adding in more volume, right? Or maybe the proximity to failure needs to increase a little bit across the board. There's many different ways you can do that. An intensity technique is just a way of increasing the stimulus, the acute stimulus that you experience within a session. Now, is that always going to lead to more gains? Not always, because like I said, training harder isn't always better, but in some cases it can. And I think as a coach, what you have to do is believe in your philosophy, if it's getting you good results, write programs for your clients and sustain them for long periods of time so you can diagnose whether they are working or not, and then add new techniques in here and there over time with each individual client based on their rate of progress, right? Every intensity technique, yes, has its place, but just because you know that an intensity technique exists, that doesn't mean you have to apply it for every single client you have on all the sets that they do. So the way I do it is I consider it on a case-to-case basis, right? For all my clients, based on how much progress I think they're making, based on the stimulus, the level of stimulus I think they're at, right? And the amount of fatigue that stimulus is generating. If the fatigue is quite low and they're coming into the gym 4, 5, 6 times a week and they're actually recovering pretty well, the fatigue cost is low, great. I'm going to add in a little bit more volume, or I might add in an intensity technique in an attempt to increase the stimulus. Okay, but keep in mind that adding in like an extra set or two, or increasing the proximity to failure, or adding in an intensity technique, right, in like at the beginning of a workout, for example, that might affect what happens towards the end of the workout. So it might seem as if you're adding in more stimulus, but across a whole workout, maybe it's actually not changing that much because of the new fatigue cost that you've incurred. Yeah. So we always have to think not just on the level of one set, but on the level of a whole workout. If you think adding in an intensity technique, if you think the benefits of that outweigh the costs, thumbs up. If not, then think of another approach.
Martin, thank you for your awesome explanation, and I concur with that. One of the studies that while you were talking, I was thinking is the deload study that released last year, the final last year.
Yep.
I don't know if you read it. It was between two groups. One did a 4-week training with to failure, and after they did a deload week, and after 4 more weeks of training, and the other group did 8 or 9 weeks of training. If I'm not mistaken, and the group that didn't do the deload had better results than the group that had the deload. So, from what we were saying about the fatigue management, maybe we are like, how can I say it, undershooting our fatigue, if it makes sense. Of course, there's the marks that we use, like for fatiguing, for performance. If the performance is going slower or down than the last week, maybe we should like do a deload, for example. I don't know if you read it. If so, can you
Yeah, I'm familiar.
Do you think it makes sense?
Yeah, I don't know the. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I don't know the finer details of that study, but I can tell you what I do in practice. And what I do is I deload my clients reactively for the most part, which means I wait until I think a deload is necessary instead of planning a deload ahead of time. Now, in some cases, I still think that's a good idea. I don't think everyone should reactively deload, because there are instances where a proactive deload is probably a good idea. But in most cases, when I'm working with individuals who have physique-related goals, I'm trying to maintain that stimulus I spoke about earlier. So I'm trying to maintain a level of harder training for as long as I can. So remember, my definition was repeatedly imposing a sufficient stimulus, right, that exceeds the threshold required for adaptation. I want to repeatedly impose that stimulus over time for as long as I can, but eventually a deload is likely required. Now, why may a deload be required? I think in most cases, it's actually psychological fatigue that warrants a deload. And I'm not exactly sure if that's a real phenomenon, but that's something that we can kind of have a chat about today. I'm sure you've noticed in your clients, Andre, sometimes they are just drained, right? So psychologically, they're just not, their head's not in the game
And myself
anymore, right? Yeah, you've noticed it in yourself too. So there's just a level of fatigue that's lingering throughout the day. And when you're not training, it's there. And you might feel a little mentally drained, and you don't feel like going into the gym to train as hard as you were 5 weeks ago, right? And you're not as motivated, right? Those are the signs that I'm often trying to pick up on, because I know if I keep pushing my client in the gym, if I keep putting them through more and more days of hard training, eventually the training that they're doing, if you're in that state, is just not going to be as conducive as it could be. And it makes sense for me in that circumstance to take one light week of training, get the mind refreshed, get their psychological state refreshed, and then build things back up again. Makes sense for me to do that. Now, of course, there are also physiological markers that we might also try to assess. But these are a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder to assess the physiological markers and then decide whether or not a deload is warranted. Now, some of the easier ones are like just general fatigue that you see on the gym floor, that you might assess via someone's performance across weeks. Right? If their performance isn't going up anymore, they're not able to progress their training, that might indicate, right, some level of psychological fatigue and maybe even some physiological fatigue that the individual is now unable to overcome. So maybe in that case you deload, right? Maybe they're starting to feel some niggles, right? Some joint-related, connective tissue-related pains, right? Something to keep in mind. And if you've got that, and you've got some of these other markers also pointing, all these signs pointing in the same direction, maybe you roll with a deload, right? I don't think you should roll with a deload if just one of those signs is pointing in that direction. But I think if multiple signs are pointing in that direction, it's probably a good idea to at least consider a deload. Now, many clients probably don't actually need a deload, right? So with the clients that I have that deload, really just the advanced ones, right? The advanced ones who actually train hard enough to warrant a deload. So they have that psychological fatigue starting to accumulate, right? Their body is also starting to feel, beaten up, and they're not recovering as well between their sessions because that level of stimulus is now so high. And, as a coach, sometimes I think it's a good idea to call a deload, rinse and repeat the process, and sometimes that can also prevent potential injuries from happening. Now, the thing is, you'll never actually know whether you will be preventing an injury with a deload or not. You can only know after the fact. So what I mean by this is, I'll give you a real-life example. I had a client not long ago in week 13 of their program, trains hard, 6 days a week, advanced client. They were about to start week 13, and I was just deciding whether or not they needed a deload. And I knew they were on the verge of needing one because they had been speaking about how they weren't as motivated. They were just feeling the pinch, not sleeping as well, feeling really tired throughout the day. Most of the signs, I won't say all, but most were pointing in that direction. Their performance was still going pretty well, though. So I'm like, okay, performance is still trending positively. Yes, you're not feeling the best, but I know you can dig deep because I've pushed you pretty hard before, and I know you can dig deep. So I want you to dig another week for me. Let's work hard for one final week, 13 weeks of training, and then we'll deload next week. So I kind of almost like negotiated with him to help get him through it. His first leg session of that week, he was doing his RDLs, and on his last rep of his last set, he strained his hamstring. Okay, so minor strain, but nonetheless a strain. This happened about 5 weeks ago, so I put him out for about 4.5 weeks from hamstring training. Now, if I had went with the deload, I would have prevented that injury. But I wouldn't have known that I would have prevented it because it would have never happened. I can only know that I would have prevented it now because it's actually happened and I didn't employ the deload. So you only know after the fact. So in hindsight, it's easy to say, I should have employed a deload. But in reality, you're never going to know whether or not that pays off in regards to injury prevention. So sometimes what I'm trying to say is going with a deload, even if it's not 100% warranted, even if one sign isn't pointing in that direction, might still be a good idea, right? And as a coach, I'm, ultimately trying to improve my ability to make that decision over time to try and hit the target more often than not over time. And unfortunately, last month I missed. Since then, we've been able to recover and clients back into training just fine, but it's just something for people out there to keep in mind.
Thank you, Martin, for the explanation. It completely makes sense. I saw the takeaway from your from your study, and I wanted to make the 3 points that you made about the takeaways, if you don't mind. Okay, first of them, when to train with some reps in reserve. What are your recommendations about that?
For sure. So my recommendations there are pretty straightforward. I would train with reps in reserve on mostly compound, highly fatiguing exercises that are prescribed towards the start of a resistance training session. I would also train with reps in reserve on exercises whereby the primary goal is to build strength and not so much muscle hypertrophy. And I would also train with reps in reserve when I have an athlete who has multiple sporting commitments. So they train in the gym, but they also have training sessions to attend for their specific sport and potentially game days on the weekend. I will train with reps in reserve there to manage fatigue and ensure that the resistance training sessions we do aren't compromising their sporting sessions, which are likely going to be more important.
And the second, when should we vary from the some reps and going to failure?
So we can look at that across a whole workout. So like I said before, I would prioritize RIR towards the start of a session, and potentially you can even look at that and say towards the start, if you're doing 3 to 4 sets of an exercise, I'd prioritize training with reps in reserve on the first 1 or 2 sets, right, of that 3 to 4 set series. And I would push closer to failure, not only as the workout comes to an end, but within each of the exercises as the sets are starting to come to an end as well. So again, I'm trying to limit the effect of acute fatigue on subsequent exercise and subsequent work that I have to do. So you don't have to train with RIR across all sets for a given exercise. You can do 2 RIR in the first set, 1 RIR in the second set, and 0 on the last one, or maybe even failure on the last one. You can also take that approach. Okay, so there's many different ways you can go about it, but for someone who has physique-related goals, that's what I'd be looking at doing, and I'd then be employing that approach, right, within the context of their overall situation. If they're in a calorie surplus, I'm going to bias more of those sets to failure. If they're in a deficit, I've got to be a little careful because they might be on the verge of breaking point, especially if they're getting very lean.
And the third one, when to train to close to failure? When should we?
Yeah, so if you have specific physique goals, if you're not in the general population where you just want to build some muscle but you don't actually want to maximize it, you want to build some muscle, lose fat, if you're not in that demographic and you're a bodybuilder, you should prioritize more sets to failure, no doubt, but I don't think you should dismiss all the other things that I've brought up as well. Like I said, isolation exercises towards the end of the session, towards the end of your sets for a specific exercise, you should be looking at pushing closer to failure and to failure. Of course, there's other things to consider as well. If you're on a low volume program, for example, or if you don't train that frequently throughout the week, you should be biasing sets closer to failure, no doubt about that. And you should even consider, which I've brought up, you have to consider whether the target muscle of a specific exercise is the limiting factor, right? So even if you are a bodybuilder and you want to maximize muscle hypertrophy, you might not need to go to failure ever on something like an RDL, because towards the end of that set, when you get closer and closer to failure, you're likely going to start using muscle groups other than your hamstrings, right? And your glutes. So those muscles might not be the limiting factors in that exercise, right? Whereas if you're doing a hamstring curl, it's a completely different story. Okay, so there's a lot of layers here. And as a coach, I think it's important to sit down and come up with a framework that can help you better make decisions. Okay, these are the circumstances where I'm going to push clients closer to failure. These are the circumstances where I'm going to ensure clients are keeping reps in reserve, pushing them away from failure. These are the circumstances where I'm going to use a combination of both. Write them down, and that will help you make better decisions.
It makes sense, and we should be thinking with reason for our programming. Martin, last takeaway that I want to make, and I'll like your opinion, is that even for, like we said on the beginning, for people that are starting to work out, to train, the importance of training with less RAR, from at least your study, it makes completely sense for people to take it easy, focus on your technique before you go with intensity.
For sure, no doubt. I think, again, in practice, proximity to failure isn't the only variable we're going to be concerned about. If we're working with a client who's untrained, who has very little training experience, there are other variables that, for me, are ahead of proximity to failure in the order of importance. Technique is an easy one. It's an obvious one. Before I can push a client to failure, I want them to have sufficient technique. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be sufficient. And at that point, I'm going to use failure as a tool to teach the clients how to push themselves in the gym. So for me, training to failure, reaching failure, that's just a set termination strategy. It's not a method, it's just a set termination strategy, just like telling someone to reach 1 RIR. Okay, so for me, RIR and failure, they sit on the same side of the fence. They're not opposing methods, because failure is on the RIR scale, right? So sometimes I'll tell clients to reach failure. Other times I'll tell them to keep some reps in reserve. Same goes for the individuals who are quite new to training. But most of their sets is going to be biased to keeping some reps in reserve. Right? Am I going to be telling them to keep 2 reps in reserve? Maybe not, but I'm going to be watching them and trying to guide them, and over time teaching them how to use RIR and how to push to failure. Right? So that's the approach that I would take in practice.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. It makes completely sense, and thank you for agreeing with me. Martin, thank you a lot for being here, having the time for the podcast. At least for myself, I learned a lot, and I think our viewers will like it as well.
No worries. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. If you're listening and you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can email me or you can message me on Instagram, mrfitness with a double underscore. Be happy to respond to any questions, and I hope you enjoy the podcast.